Thank you to the Anglo-Omani Society for inviting me. I have with me my colleague Chris Eilert as well, because though it mentions me and Greg, Chris was really instrumental in some of the research and the diagrams that you're going to see later. So as Jane said, let's make this interactive. I've prepared a lot of slides, but stop me at any point and, add your thoughts or questions. I'm sure you know a lot more than I do about Oman. So what I've tried to do is talk about the MENA region, but with an Omani lens. So I've tried to draw attention to the issues that Oman will face and some of the implications along the way, while I'm describing some more generic risks. So I will present in 4 parts. So first, looking at how climate change is affecting the Gulf region in general. Secondly, how we can understand what we're calling cascading risks and what their relevance is to Oman, and I'll say a bit about the project that we're working on for the EU. Thirdly, Oman as an example for the region in disaster risk reduction. I'll say a little bit about the issues of strategy that are coming together in Oman, which impressed us, and 4, the opportunities for business and industry. I know that's of interest to some of you in the society, and there are many. What I won't talk about too much is, or I won't mention that much, is energy. I think there are lots of talks on oil and gas, and that's actually my background, and I'm happy to pick up questions on hydrogen, oil and gas later maybe, but we'll focus on the environment and the physical impacts and the societal impacts. So how is climate change affecting the Gulf region? Well, we can think about slow onset. We can think about slow onset impacts like rising temperatures, changing seasons, unpredictable rainfall, overall reduced annual rainfall in some regions, and the widening dead zones and the threats to coral reefs, especially in the Arabian Gulf. And we can think about hazards such as flash floods and landslides, the increased severity of tropical storms and cyclones, sand and dust storms, which we saw in May. And they seem to be increasing in severity, and heat waves as well, especially in terms of the number of extremely hot days and the rise in the minimum temperatures and humidity, especially in the coastal areas. But of course, these slow onset changes and hazards combine and compound, and it's good to bear that in mind as we go through. So I'll mention a bit about both. I think what everyone will think of when they think of Oman and climate change are intensifying tropical storms. Actually, storms are not new to Oman. I know it had one of the most tragic ones, perhaps the most tragic one in 1977, but they do seem to have been increasing in frequency, and with urban build-up they can actually cause a lot more damage today than they could have done. You also see sand and dust storms in the interior mainly, especially across Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. I think the ones in May did touch Oman, and they affected Kuwait as well. They closed airports and ports for a day or so and caused massive health impacts. There was thousands hospitalized with respiratory problems because of these, and that's not just to do, climate change plays a role because of maybe the strength of the wind, because of the warming, but it's very much, you can very much see it as a compound risk together with localized changes to the environment, poor management of water, damming, so there's less water and less moisture, drying soils, removal of vegetation. In Iraq, which has suffered particularly badly from these. It's also military operations that have tended to compact the ground and the drying of the marshlands. So another one is the loss of marine biodiversity, and that has been noticed and studied in the Gulf of Oman with these widening dead zones, and there's been some cooperation between British universities and Omani universities on that issue. Again, not just to do with climate change, but the warming is certainly playing a role in that, and also in the bleaching of coral reefs in the Gulf. And also unlivable temperatures, which we mentioned before. The region has definitely been seeing seeing much higher temperatures in the summer, and the highest temperatures have tended to be around this area. Iraq has reached, Iraq and parts of Saudi Arabia have reached over 50 degrees in the last few years, and as the Washington Post pointed out, climate scientists warn that extreme temperatures faced in places like southern Iraq are a small taste of what will follow elsewhere. In 2018, Muscat recorded its highest ever minimum temperature of 42.6 Celsius. If you imagine that, all day, so with no respite at night time, that can have very serious effects on health if you are outside or with no air conditioning. And there's also this issue of extreme humidity, which might be one of the most serious health risks that we face from climate change, and this is especially in coastal areas. You see the highest ones. This was a wet bulb temperature taken with a sort of a thermometer that measures humidity, and it basically means the body can't sweat. The sweat can't evaporate over a certain level, and that level is around 35. So, if this is the maximum temperature between 1979 and 2017, and you see these red spots around the Gulf region. So that is climbing up too. It's a problem because, yes, the body can't cool down. Humidity is expected to go beyond the level by which the body can tolerate several times in this latter period of the century, but of course things are speeding up, and certainly with higher emission scenarios we expect that to be more frequent, and that shows the level at which, the worst climate scenario that the IPCC presents, the 8.5 scenario, how much it would have, how much that purple, which is the danger zone, how much that would have heated up by 2071 to 2100. What can be expected to 2050 and beyond? We compiled something in the report which is available online. This is just a summary. I just wanted to pull out the quote really rather than reading anything out, because the most significant thing is that over the next 30 years, current water use, agricultural and building practices will become untenable, and then beyond 2050, livability in the MENA region will be determined significantly by the global emissions trajectory. So we know that a 1.5 Celsius average global temperature rise, it will be not good, we're already seeing that, but above that it gets extremely serious. So, how can we understand cascading climate risks? A bit about the project we're working on. We're working with 12 partners across Europe as part of an EU Horizons funded project to look at how the impacts of climate change in other parts of the world could compound with social dynamics and cause risks in the system that Europe is a part of. So how could they affect Europe, and what are the recommended mitigation and adaptation pathways that maybe Europe can pursue with other actors in other regions. So we started, this is a 4-year project. We work specifically on leading the Middle East and North Africa part of it, and we were looking at sort of 2 questions. How might the impacts of climate change collide and compound with systemic and local dynamics to create risk for Europe, and how can European actors respond to help reduce risk and build resilience? And within that, we're interested in the impacts themselves, but how they might transmit through international trade, through conflict dynamics and diplomacy, through finance and business networks, and how they might affect financial stability, politics, food affordability, these kind of issues in Europe, and some of the climate responses, how Europe might have more coherent policies towards these kind of issues. And it's not just about migration, it's also, very much about diplomacy and responding to security risks and investment. So this is how we kind of visualized how climate change might play into existing socio-political and economic dynamics. These are the climate, this is like a slow onset change, increased temperatures, and this is a hazard, it's like a tropical storm, and this is how it might have an immediate initial impact in a country or a region. So this is a tropical storm leading to loss and damage to coastal areas, how that might mean reduced income for business and tourism, and how that might then lead to job losses, which might feed into other problems and cause violent unrest, for instance, and insecurity, and maybe migration. And these lozenges here are how governments might, in that sense, governments might respond, or there might be local factors that influence this, like unregulated building on floodplains, which is a big issue in the Gulf region, or lack of early warning and disaster risk reduction capacity. So that kind of indicates where the vulnerabilities might be, and there might also be international factors like reduced international oil prices in future because of energy transition, or international food prices rises, which you're seeing the impact of at the moment because the MENA region is highly dependent on imports of food. If we think about the actual what these kind of these kind of cascading risks might look like, we think of in terms of hazards like a tropical storm and the loss of life and infrastructure damage and business losses that this might lead to. Just copy pasted a bit from the report here on the many storms that Oman has suffered. The worst recent one being Cyclone Gonu in 2007, where 50 people died, and it was the country was estimated to suffer 4.2 billion in economic losses, and really that appears to have been a huge spur to the government and civil society, universities to work on disaster risk reduction and climate strategy in the country. And many things have happened since 2007, and we're very interested to learn about how those communities have come together to try and solve some of the problems in infrastructure and urban planning in particular that those storms had caused. And as you see, there has been at least some less loss of life in subsequent storms. Another issue is farm losses leading to rural to urban migration. I put a picture that I took from an academic paper on Batina, and showing the salinity of groundwater levels in that region affecting farms, and you can see how that's been increasing. It tends to be happening sort of 2 to 3 kilometers inland, but it can be up to 5. And this has happened because of over abstraction coupled with less rainwater, so less recharge, and then storm surges, and in future there will be rising sea levels. So it's a very very current problem. There's also the problem in other areas on higher ground where warmer winters have ruined fruit harvests. So the other issue is damage to health and mobility. I think I've already mentioned the storms, but we can also think about how these might lead countries to blame their neighbours for the problems, given that dust and sandstorms are caused by environmental mismanagement in other countries. There's been a lot of blame on other countries for damming, for example, and they can cause tensions because they cause electricity outages where there's a network serving 2 countries or more, and you can see these compounding in places like Khuzestan and parts of Iraq, together with existing tensions over water and inequality. Here's an example from the terrible water poisonings that happened, the water contamination in Basra. So climate change would just be a part of the reason that took place in 2018. It's an example of where an environmental threat can spill over, can trigger violent protests because people are frustrated about many other things. As the quote from one of the protesters shows, we have a treasure trove of oil beneath our feet, so how is it possible we don't have drinking water? So it accentuates that feeling of unfairness. How did we try? We tried to illustrate some of these risks. Now, you can't possibly read this, so I would actually invite Chris to come and explain it, but that would take far too long. But basically, we were trying to show how these This is a sort of generic risk cascade for the Gulf, for the GCC region, and it shows how increased acidity of seawater, increased sea levels, tropical storms, and increased temperatures could all kind of compound to cause health issues, to cause damage to infrastructure, to cause health impacts and loss of business and loss of tourism, and then to compound with fiscal and current account crises that were happening because of the price of oil and gas potentially, and that leading to inability to cope with some of these problems, asset losses for investors and so on. So that's the kind of negative picture. And we spoke to a lot of experts in the region as to where they thought the biggest vulnerabilities were, or what was causing vulnerability or what was exacerbating vulnerabilities to climate change in the region. And I've put a few there, but there are many. But I've just mentioned a few that might be of interest. One is the non or low pricing of water, or the lack of regulation over groundwater, or cases where large businesses or state-owned businesses are monopolising sources of water. The lack of space for civil society was a huge one, because first response was expected to happen at the local level, as well as needing, the need for civil society to spread awareness and harness public behaviour change nationally. Weak enablement at the local level was called out a few times, many times actually. The need for municipal governments, wilayat in Oman, as well as municipal agencies, to be more empowered to be able to prepare as well as respond to climate change impacts. Land control and land acquisition is a huge issue, and the need to be very the need to have a rule of law which would enable people to cope better with climate change, and there are many different issues facing different countries, from the Israeli occupation and the Palestinian areas to areas to issues of large agribusiness, for instance, kicking out small farmers in other countries. So then there's the issue of lack of finance. I thought that was interesting that only 8% of bank lending in the MENA is available to small to medium-sized enterprises. And many people pointed out that small to medium-sized enterprises are needed not only to be innovative and come up with solutions to some of these evolving threats in the environment, but also to enable diversification and provide jobs in countries that are wanting to diversify their economies beyond oil and gas. And finally, very, very relevant to Oman, is this lack of or non-implementation of building codes, given that enforcement is really critical, especially when it comes to flooding, but also other issues of energy efficiency. But not building on wadis, natural drainage channels, is very, very important for Oman. So how can we, does anyone want to ask any questions before I move on to this part? Oh, yeah, just so you know. So how can we think about adaptation and resilience? I've just put a definition there, because we do mix these up, adaptation and resilience, and they are close to each other, but it's worth thinking about them separately. Adaptation is referring to adjustments in ecological, social, or economic systems in response to actual or expected climate stimuli or their effects and impacts. It can range from building flood defences, setting up early warning systems for cyclones, switching to drought-resistant crops, or in Oman's case, crops that can live with a saline soil, which is very important, redesigning communication systems or government policies. And then resilience is really looking at kind of system-wide resilience. So it's a system's ability to return to its original state or move to a new, more desirable state after being disturbed. So it might include education, capacities to deploy social safety nets, sort of food security issues, urban design that reduces fuel and energy dependence, as well as sort of community level organisation, ability to bounce back, basically. And it's quite interesting, I think, in Arabic that there's no clear word for resilience. There's several words that get used for resilience. Samud, Mana'am, what's the other one? Muqawam, yeah, and they all mean different things. Is it facing something? Is it standing like stubbornly against something? Or is it being murawana, like flexible to change, or preventing something? So I think it's a bit of all of those. So what will influence the shape and severity of climate impacts in the MENA societies? I thought I would just draw attention to a few of the issues that expert respondents in the region drew attention to. This is for the region as a whole. So number one was stability, and of course, you know, many people drew attention to the conflicts in the region and how they inhibited governments from from implementing a stable strategy, and they also prevented, you know, publics from being concerned about this issue because they are much more worried about immediate issues. If you're worried about your home being bombed, you don't worry about climate change, as one said. That might have been you, Jane. Anyway, also the capability for decentralized decision making and implementation by local authorities, that was really strong. And thirdly, public awareness, and especially space for civil society organisations. And fourthly, the private sector innovation and ability to deliver green and resilient solutions through the market. So if we move on to Oman, I just drew from Oman's national report to the UNFCCC in terms of the impacts it expects to face. Water resources being a huge concern. There has been an increase in extreme rainfall that makes it different to some of the other countries in the region. So many of them are facing flash floods, but that could be, you know, both a curse and a blessing in some ways. The marine fisheries, the issue of the Western Arabian Sea becoming more saline, and the decline in sardine and yellowfin tuna, for example. Agriculture, so we've mentioned already, particularly in Batina, and the drop in aquifer levels. Urban areas, tourism and infrastructure. There was a tenfold increase in at-risk areas in Muscat, and the threat of tropical cyclones. And health. There have been outbreaks of malaria and dengue fever in the last few years, and the exposure of the very young and very old to heat stress is clearly a concern. So I thought I would say a little bit about Oman's exemplary strategic approaches. I'm sure you have heard talks here on Oman's Vision 2040 and also the national strategy the national spatial strategy. There is also the national strategy for climate change, adaptation and mitigation, which came out recently and is very linked to the spatial strategy. And there is also this development going on of subscale policies like master plans for neighbourhoods, which I think is you know, it's the national strategy for climate change and adaptation and mitigation is I think the first of its kind in the region. I've not seen another one that takes on this breadth of issues and that works at the local spatial level. I won't read all of these, but we were impressed that since 2010, following on from Cyclone Gonu, Omani authorities have worked with UNESCO, the World Heritage Organization, to develop a multi-hazard early warning system, which was launched in 2015, and weather radar has been developed for cyclone and flood warnings, allowing for evacuation of high-risk areas, and the Directorate of General Meteorology and Public Authority for Civil Aviation oversee those. After Cyclone Gonu, many families didn't have access to water, and because some of the network was taken out, and there is a huge emphasis on treatment of wastewater and sewerage, and plans to invest about 7 billion in clean water and sanitation over the next 20 years. And then there's the spatial strategy. I thought what was interesting was the cross-sector engagement. So particularly regarding the Vision 2040 and the spatial strategy, there was so much encouragement of sharing of information across government entities, but also with the academic community. So Sultan Qaboos University supporting with expertise, as well as the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, collaborating with the ministries to prepare this plan. And we hadn't seen so many examples of that around the region. In fact, most of the experts who responded to our study said our problem is lack of coordination. It's all housed within the Ministry of Environment, or it's all within the Ministry of Water and Agriculture, and we don't really talk to each other. So this was quite amazing to hear about. And we had a lovely meeting in Dubai at MENA Climate Week, where we have 2 participants from Sultan Qaboos University talking about some of their efforts and engagement, and there's clearly so much work going on both on agriculture and climate-sensitive agriculture, and urban planning, use of drones to make maps of areas that are at risk from flooding, and also to work on the building code. So that's one of the slides that one of our participants, Noura Nasiri, used in her presentation, just to show how the strategic objectives of Vision 2040 and the spatial strategy are linked and kind of coordinate towards managing the environment and the response to climate change. Interestingly, the priority sectors are water resources, marine biodiversity and fisheries, agriculture, urban areas, tourism and infrastructure, and public health, so pretty much everything. And very much tied to diversification. So what did we put in our report as the 4 priorities for resilience and adaptation in the region? We focused on valuing water, building fit for 2100, nature regeneration and remediation as civil protection, and expanded food policies with co-benefits. So I was trying to think about, just move to thinking about how these would, what these would mean for Oman, and what the opportunities for business and investment might be. And I really welcome your thoughts on these things, because I have just pulled out what I thought was interesting. So on the valuing water side, I mentioned some of the recommendations from the report, and I thought of particular interest would be regulating groundwater withdrawals and the economic pricing of water. So Oman's made a lot of progress in reducing subsidies for electricity and water provision since at least 2016. And we worked with the Authority for Electricity Regulation, which I think is now the Authority for Public Services Regulation. You can correct me. We were doing a lot of work on reforming of pricing and raising awareness of the need for efficiency, and also now they have launched a couple of programs on efficiency nationwide. So there is that issue, but regulating the groundwater is really much more difficult, and so that will be of interest. And then this issue of the use of non-conventional water resources, and also of rainwater capture or rainwater storage. And there have been some groundwater recharge dams planned or being built in Oman. There's some issues with damming, as always, and as one person pointed out, you don't want to completely stop the nutrients going back into the sea, because that's what provides for the marine life, but at the same time, if you're able to capture some of that water and recharge the aquifers, then that could be extremely useful. Building fit for 2100, what can we point out? We pointed out aqua recharge, buildings. There's a huge opportunity to retrofit buildings, and we've been working on this issue in Jordan, actually, and also in years ago I did work with Oman and the UAE and Saudi on these issues. huge potential. I mean, I remember one of the studies from a long time ago in Abu Dhabi showed that just by maintaining, just by cleaning out the air conditioning, not even replacing it, but just by cleaning it out, you could save about 30% of the cooling load in some of those big buildings. But also there's many things you can do to make those buildings a nicer, a better environment to sustain climate change, whether that's painting the roofs white or adding shading to buildings. There's a lot you can do with existing buildings. There is a plan for an establishment of a super energy services company in Oman, like they have in Dubai, which has done really well at stimulating that market in Dubai. There's also, at the more sort of low-income housing end, we did this project in Jordan as part of the refugee response, which was about green affordable homes for lower-income Jordanian families, and it was a really interesting one because there were so many aspects of retrofitting a home in quite an economic way that would also improve well-being, such as just providing a cooler temperature, lowering your electricity bills, making it quieter with the double glazing and so on. And this is a nice project to use agricultural waste to create window shading from the old window frames that have been taken out. So it's like an upcycling project. So I would like to emphasize the value of the low-tech solutions as well as the high-tech solutions. There's some interesting examples of British Omani cooperation on the built environment. So the British Standards Institute won a competition to advise on Oman's national building codes with the Planning Council in Oman, and there's input from University College London and Arab on that. And there's a British architectural urban planning company, Allies Morrison, which is planning this eco city expansion of Muscat, Medina Al which looks to be designed in harmony with the wadis and with the nature already existent in that area. And as you can see, the way that it's planned is not the sort of straightforward grid that many cities in the region have been built in, but rather it works in harmony with the natural layout of the land. So, thirdly, we talked about nature regeneration as remediation and civil protection, and I just thought I'd point to this amazing project pursued by Oman's national oil company, PDO, which had a major problem with groundwater coming up with oil production. So I think for every barrel of oil being produced, I've got a feeling that it was about 9 barrels of this brackish water that would come up, really black though, you couldn't use it for anything. And what was interesting around when I was talking about the reform of energy pricing and the fuel pricing, when the price of electricity was raised, because the price of gas was raised as well, that also applied to the national oil company, and that meant that it was becoming too expensive in terms of the production of oil to use electricity to pump that brackish water back into the ground. So they had to search for other solutions, and as we say, the necessity is the mother of invention, and they came up with this project which was implemented by Bauer, a German company, using I think Australian reed bed technology to create wetlands which essentially cleaned the water. So it would go through some treatment, and then as one official from the PDO told me, he said, it went in black, it was completely black, and I couldn't believe it. At the other side, it came out as this fresh water. Of course, this water being produced is saline. It's saline, so you can't use it for normal agriculture, but what they are trying to do now is develop biosaline agriculture so that it can be used efficiently to produce crops, which is very exciting, the NIMR project. And fourthly, we recommended expanding food policies. I know food security is of huge interest to Oman, especially when you look at what's happening to the prices today because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and the high dependence of the region on food imports. So we expect in future climate crises to affect the availability of food from many regions. That's already happened in the past with droughts and wildfires in Russia in 2010, for example. And you see India has now put a ban on some of its exports because of the current crisis and the droughts and climate change in the country. So in future we do expect volatile food prices, and there's this opportunity to find the right balance of locally produced and imported foodstuffs, especially as you're making that transition and potentially losing revenue from oil and gas. Then we have to think about addressing the current account balance, which is something that I don't think many countries are doing, but it's a very important issue for the future. We've mentioned a few other things, including nutrition and diets, because we do, just globally, we need to diversify away from our dependence on just sort of 2 to 4 grains, really, that we eat a huge amount of, and looking at what we can produce with less chemicals, for example, and produce locally too. And of course there's the welfare and social safety nets issue. I think a very interesting issue for Oman is the potential to compost. There's still a lot of food waste. I think one study suggested that a third of food consumed is wasted. A third that's bought is wasted in the region, and so there is this opportunity to use composting. Now this is being done. This is not with food, but with sludge. With waste from sewerage, and it's being done by the Higher Water. You might know of this project in cooperation with Sultan Qaboos University. They did a pilot called the Kala compost plant, which takes about 50,000 tons of sludge each year and turns it into sellable compost for farmers. And it's been found that this works really, really well and actually produces better crops than the chemical fertilizer. So there's another example in Jordan of the Asamra wastewater treatment plant, which similarly takes wastewater. It's a huge plant. It's been expanded as well, and uses mainly its own produced biogas and hydropower to treat that waste, turn some of it into sludge for fertilizer, and the rest is clean, usable water for farmers in the Jordan Valley. So these examples are in the region. They are being pursued. They are being pursued commercially, which is quite amazing and need to be scaled up. I thought I'd just end with this slide, which is the need to really encourage small to medium-sized enterprises if you want to see that kind of dynamic enterprise that really responds quickly and nimbly to these evolving challenges. And generally in the region, people pointed out these problems again and again. The fact that bankruptcy laws currently disincentivize the taking on of risk. People think they'll end up in prison if they cannot pay their debts. And the need for finance and market instruments to address small to medium-sized business needs, and particularly in the green space. So the need for green catalyst funds, de-risking mechanisms, and there's already a certain use of bonds, but it's still mainly for large companies, and basically, the need for the regulation to incentivize business in green construction, climate smart food production, weatherization of buildings, and water conservation, for example. In Oman, this is the IMF's diagram showing the kind of score in doing business in Oman, and you see that resolving insolvency still needs work, as well as enforcement of contracts at the legal side, and the access to credit potentially. But it's very good on starting a business and on getting electricity, for instance, or registering property. There are other issues like the moves to phase out subsidies and water, which has been, the idea is to phase them out completely by 2025. I guess it's been a bit of a step back in the current price crisis, but one would hope that would continue. That will incentivize a lot of good things, as it has with the NIMA project and the retrofitting. And then the there's general legal changes to the encouraging investment under Sultan Haytham, which you will know more about, which encourage foreign investment. And then and there's been recent energy focus initiatives. Yasir is about energy efficiency, especially for trying to regulate for that environment and incentivize investments in efficiency. And Sahim is for small scale solar PV, and the Bank of Muscat is also offering green loans for those kind of things. So there's lots going on. There's work to be done, and from my perspective, again, you will know a lot more about the Omani context than me, but I hope that leaves you with some food for thought.
Thank you so much for that really rich presentation, Glada, and for taking us all the way from the enormity of the regional challenges to some of the quite inspiring things that are being done creatively to adapt and mitigate. We'd love to throw it open to comments and questions. So let's start with the lady over here. I don't know if we have a roving mic, or hope maybe you can speak loudly.
I'll try to speak as loudly as I can.
This works.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah. Thank you so much for this presentation. That was really excellent, fascinating.
Would you mind if I ask you to briefly introduce where you come from?
Sure. So I'm the Gulf coordinator at the Institute for Human Rights and Business. We're currently working also on a Gulf program including Oman, looking mainly at the social side of environmental issues, focused on the rights of workers, especially migrant workers in the GCC region. But climate, of course, is a very important aspect to that. And that's also what my question is about in terms of framing and discussing issues around climate. As you mentioned, they're very siloed, so we have groups talking about climate, environment, and groups talking about social, labor, human rights, and they tend to not sit in one room and discuss it as one issue. So my question is, in terms of framing, do you see any changes there? Are governments in the GCC especially using more like a just transition framework, or looking at ESG more in a combined or integrated way, or is it still quite siloed? And the second question, if I can ask the second question, would be outside Oman, more generally, would you say is the most promising development in terms of climate action?
Thank you.
Okay, really interesting issues that you raised. Maybe I'll come set up here so I can see everyone. Yeah, really interesting issues, and I think I really believe in bringing these issues together. I agree with you that they are siloed, and yes, they are siloed in the GCC region. However, they kept coming up again and again when we talked to experts who worked on the environment. They were definitely not seen as separate, of course, for sustainable solutions. You also need to think of social sustainability and, most importantly, accountability. As you saw with some of the flashpoints that I mentioned, like the Basra example, you can see this in Khuzestan, you can see this in Lebanon, in Algeria. When protests break out, which are triggered or part triggered by an environmental issue, they're always linked to issues of inequality, corruption, mismanagement, and that is really at the root of the frustrations, and often the environmental failure draws attention to it and makes it really acute. So they're problems that could have been solved much earlier had there been more awareness raising, more accountability in the system, and civil society can help bring that accountability. But because the rule of law is not applied as it should have been, then these disasters were able to happen. I mean, one example is is one of the first examples I came across actually when I was looking into environment and its interactions with society in the MENA. I was doing an article for Majalla, and I began with the Jeddah floods in 2009. And everyone I spoke to, drew attention to the fact that that drainage should have been built in Jeddah, and it was a failure of potentially everyone down the line taking a cut, and the company that was supposed to put in place the drainage really not building it properly. In fact, it was very superficial with just the manholes. And so that disaster, which led to many deaths and destruction of households, was seen by people in Jeddah as a gross failure, really. And as you saw, the government had to address it because it was threatening legitimacy. So we found our expert respondents constantly drawing attention to these issues as completely in line with the need for greater rule of law and greater fairness and justice. So yeah, what was the other question? Good examples of?
Just the most promising development you've seen in the region.
So I mentioned Asamra in Jordan. I really liked it because of the way it was financed, and we had this presented as an example from the Jordanian Ministry of Water at our event at MENA Climate Week. And it had been initially spurred by funding from the Millennium Challenge Corporation, but also with local funding, local bank funding and Jordanian government funding. And it was done in a way that created accountability. It resulted in commercial, a very commercial system which is providing water cheaper than through other sources. So that's a good one. That's encouraged foreign investment as well. There's some really great smaller scale local projects as well. Another example that we showcased was from the Tigris in Iraq, where the Protect the Tigris, the Hamad Dijla organization is working with villagers to create eco-villages and attract tourism in a very, really reviving traditional skills and encouraging the authentic, encouraging the maintenance of an authentic cultural practice, I think, in opposition to, building massive hotels that will use up even more water, that kind of thing. So there's there are many, but I know they don't always get enough light or.
Any other questions? Please.
Just a comment. I'm Shama. I'm senior researcher at the Gulf Research Center. When you mentioned Jeddah, I'm not an expert on the subject, but I think that until recently, that governments in the region, the whole region, with no exception, did not take the matter seriously. They thought it was a joke, actually. Until recently, we've seen movement in this path. We're seeing initiatives, real movement, building of the infrastructure, legal infrastructure and technical infrastructure that did not exist at all in the past. And as an expert, do you think that this is a serious movement, or is it used for the local and external consumption?
Yes, I do think it's real. Thank you for this question, because I have to say, when I was first working in the region, in the GCC, around 2010, you're absolutely right. It was seen as from my point of view anyway, it was seen as a kind of conspiracy theory, really. This is yet another thing to bash us with, just because we have some oil, and we shouldn't ignore it. And as you know, for many years, the GCC countries, and particularly Saudi, were seen as the blockers in the climate negotiations because they were saying it would affect their economic interests. And I think that view has really changed. I mean, partly because Saudi Arabia in particular has realized that it doesn't have much to lose, given that its oil resources are one of the cheapest to extract and will be valuable in the world market for some time, longer than other countries. That doesn't mean forever, but sometime longer than other countries. There was a realization I felt around 2012. A few things happened. I was just saying in a conversation before we began, we published a report, my colleague and I published a report on Saudi Arabia called Burning Oil to Keep Cool in 2011, and we didn't think it would have much take-up, but it became a big contentious issue because we pointed out that so much oil and gas was being used domestically so as to threaten future exports, as well as just loss of value, for future generations, which that was an amazing response from not just Saudi Arabia but other countries in the Gulf region, saying we want to be more efficient. You know, what's happening right now does not adhere to Islamic principles. It doesn't, and it's not helping. You know, it's not helping our children. It's wasting precious resources. So there was already moves going on, especially amongst the electricity and water regulators, to try to conserve, because they knew how much they were wasting. So I think that move was very interesting. It was interesting how technical experts were coming together from the region to learn from each other. And then, of course, these other environmental impacts, you cannot avoid them now. You know, I see Mohammed bin Salman has mentioned the increase in dust and sandstorms, the Saudi Green Vision, the Saudi Green Initiative has looked at, you know, is looking at regenerative agricultural practices. There are grants available for these kind of activities in Saudi Arabia, which you've never seen before. There does appear to be genuine movement now, as it is seen as imperative, really, for maintaining livable space for people. So I realise it's easy to be cynical about some of the moves in the Gulf, especially when you see mega projects conflicting with the need for sustainability. And there has been a tendency to, you know, I remember Stefan Hertog, our friend from LSE, talking about islands of efficiency, you know, this idea, islands of efficiency, and also sort of vanity projects whereby the big projects get all the attention, but you might have something like Masdar, but you also have a massive golf resort, and you know, you have a new industrial city which is maybe not paying attention to any water sustainability. So I think that's still going on, and I think the drive for business and investment and GDP growth is still conflicting with the need for environmental sustainability. However, I think you're absolutely right, like in the narrative and the understanding of environmental change and degradation combined with climate change is real. And young people in particular, I mean, this is a population with such a huge young population, well-educated, using social media all the time. They are not isolated from what's going on globally, and we found some of the most vociferous proponents of radical change to combat climate change and to revive the environment were in their 30s or under 30. And so we are launching a competition, by the way, for young people to submit their ideas, which I'm quite excited about. But yes.
Please, the lady here, and then we'll come to the gentleman there.
So thank you for your presentation. My name is Nadine Rose. On one of your slides, you said sort of moving beyond GDP, looking at sustainable futures, into well-being. So I think at the bottom of one of the slides it said beyond GDP to well-being. I just wondered, is there a definition of well-being, and can it be measured?
So funny you mentioned that, because we just had a meeting about that today. We're writing a paper on it, and I didn't want to go into it in the presentation because it's such a huge subject. So yes, one of the problems, as you probably all aware, is the world is still using GDP as the performance measure, and countries take this extremely seriously because it's what they're measured. You know, when the IMF come to do their country assessments, if you look at Oman's or Saudi or Kuwait's IMF country assessment, GDP factor's really big. Is it growing? Is it declining? What's everything else measured in terms of a percentage of GDP? Yet GDP growth as an objective is really problematic because of what it counts. And as we all know, it counts unsustainable practices, and it doesn't count environmental damage, or as they call it, externalities, either in terms of people's health or in terms of environmental losses. So there have been lots of attempts to try to address this. I mean, the World Bank produced a paper, I think last year or early this year, called The Changing Wealth of Nations, which looks to account for natural capital and natural capital losses. There's numerous well-being measures. UAE is big on happiness. Nepal has no, not Nepal. Bhutan. Bhutan has introduced its own indicators, which are very specific to Bhutan, by the way, on happiness. So there's subjective measures, there's various measures that take into account the human development indicators. However, all those measures, and there are hundreds of them, they're not produced anywhere near as frequently as GDP, which is a whole industry that comes like once a month. These figures are published, and accountants know how to put them together. They're trained that way, or they're very subjective, so they're not comparable, or only certain countries produce them, these other indicators. So we would love to see that change happen. I think it will have to happen, that you probably keep GDP, but you put it against other measures which are raised to the same level, because there's some really interesting work like by Kate Raworth on the donors economics, I'm sure you're aware of, which look at, instead of aiming just for this constant growth path, we need to be fulfilling human needs, which is basically sort of meeting your SDGs, and that's your sort of higher aim, but then you're limited by your planetary boundaries, so you want to aim somewhere in the middle of this donut she talks about. So I think it'll be a mix in the end, but we have to start talking about things differently. So that's the most important thing, is not just talking, being obsessed by growth. It's like coming out of this COVID crisis. Growth is not a sustainable way forward, so it's a chance for us to rethink that.
Thank you. Let's take a question from the gentleman here.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. My name is Guy Wilkinson. You mentioned the scheme in Jordan had a really interesting way of financing the project that you were talking about. I was wondering if you could just give some specifics on that. And then also, part B of that is, to what extent are financial institutions in the MENA region taking into account climate risk and doing practices like scenario analysis and things like that? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's probably better for me to send you the diagram which explains this rather complicated financing structure, but it did involve setting up a separate entity in Jordan which was kind of insulated to manage those funds coming in from different entities, and as I said, there was local funding as well as the grant. So I guess the Millennium Challenge grant fund provided kind of insulated some of those other entities from risk. Basically, it lowered the risk of such an investment, and it allowed others to come in, and it allowed private sector investors to come in. But it also, the structure of it also was strong on accountability and kind of pushed efficiency measures going forward, so it has made it commercially viable, which is really important. So yeah, I'm happy to get your details and send you more. Are they taking climate risk seriously? I think there's not enough work anywhere on this, actually. It's really, especially the kind of cascading risks that we were talking about, it's quite new to think of things systemically, but now we've had the COVID crisis, we've got, well, it's still kind of ongoing, we've got climate change, and we've got the Russia-Ukraine war. These are three things that have really shown that our world is so interconnected. These crises are not isolated, they affect food prices in other places, fertilizer prices, they affect mobility, they've affected the production of certain goods, they affect supply chains, they play into conflict. So we have to think in a much more systemic way. So I think we've seen some really great work going on in Jordan, looking at climate risks, in Oman, as I've mentioned, and I keep coming back to Oman as a really great example of coordination on disaster risk reduction in particular, because this is a serious issue that you see when you've seen some of the disasters recently in Iraq, Iran, Syria, places that haven't got the capacity to do disaster risk reduction, and it's led to many deaths. Yemen, being a really obvious one that is right next door to Oman, and yet has suffered from conflict, poverty, and everything else that's meant that flooding, led to well over 100 deaths last time it happened. No, lots of work to be done, and I think that's where we're making recommendations for the EU, and we thought that Europe's satellite capabilities, its early warning system capabilities could definitely be shared and expanded with countries in the region to help them plan.
Thank you. I see a question here, the lady in the lovely pink shirt, and then we'll take yours right after.
Thank you so much for the fascinating talk. And here we are discussing climate change. Now, when you look at your graphs, does it tell us anything about how we might be heading for a mini ice age? I mean, we had one here 300 years ago. We've seen fluctuations in the UK of our climate. Certainly in Roman times, we haven't reached Roman times yet, because the water level hasn't gone up to the extent that it was up in Roman times. They were growing grapes, but of course they weren't genetically engineered. So I'm just wondering whether, it won't apply to us, but whether on your graphs you see that there's hope of the climate changing downwards. And another fascinating thing is Krakatoa. After Krakatoa erupted about 100 years ago, the cloud cover meant there were no crops for 2 years. I mean, that's, beyond our control, isn't it?
Thank you.
Yes, well, our boss, Jim Benson, would definitely be the person to ask about that. I've not seen anything predicting another ice age. However, several scientists are talking about potential tipping points, where you get either sort of the feedback loops from melting of permafrosts, adding methane to the atmosphere and speeding things up very violently, the melting of ice in the Arctic, and that causing a complete disruption of our weather system, a reversal of the Gulf Stream, for example, overturning of the AMOC, which I never remember the proper words for, but basically a vast disruption to our global weather patterns is possible, so you could get completely different weather to what we're expecting if existing systems are pushed too far. So there are some interesting papers if you Google tipping points. Sorry, about Krakatoa.
Wouldn't it?
Well, we actually said in our report, like, we're not going to deal with the tipping points, but the Krakatoa example is really fascinating, and that led to all sorts of other social changes and political dynamics that show how these climatic events will have political and social implications way beyond what you imagine.
And the lady here, please.
Hi, my name's Sophie. My colleague Sabrina and I, we work for a company called Radus, which provides investigation support to contentious arbitration investigation, and we work on the Middle East desk, so we get a lot of kind of corruption in the Ministry of Oil and Iraq and things like that. My question, what was my question? My question is about climate litigation. So we've seen quite a big interest in sort of climate litigation recently. I wondered if you'd seen that quite a lot internationally in the MENA region or in sort of integrity commissions. Is that something you're seeing a lot of, or not yet?
I'm not seeing it in the region so much, but it is happening globally, yes. And there is an interesting paper that our international law program has prepared. You might have seen it on the use of human rights law in climate-related cases, because, again, bring it back to your point about whether these two issues are combining, you're certainly seeing human rights law being tailored to cases where there's environmental injustices or governments that are being seen not to being charged with not acting fast enough or not acting according with their own commitments on climate change, and thereby endangering the rights of current and future generations. So that those cases are growing, and interestingly, people are learning from each other. Groups are learning from each other on what has worked best. And of course, once legal precedents are set, then there's the opportunity to pursue more cases in that field. There have been some cases. I mean, I think there was one about my understanding, it was very hazy, but I think there were some actions against coal plant in Egypt. And interestingly, one of the problems there was getting evidence in Arabic for the judge to use, for the judge to hear. And that, you know, having enough published materials in Arabic is an issue for accountability. There's also interest, you mentioned Iraq and the oil companies. There's a huge amount of pollution, as you know. There, Human Rights Watch called out in a report that came after the Basra poisonings that I mentioned. And there is strong interest in civil society pursuing legal actions against those companies for that pollution. So I don't think it's reached courts. You probably know better than me. Lebanon is one where they actually have stopped a dam. There's a case of civil society groups actually managing to prevent a World Bank funded proposal for a dam. But yeah, I think it's still an evolving area, but it's still small from the region compared to, say, Latin America, where they've been using human rights and climate cases for some time.
Can I just add to that? There's also a lot of, besides the human rights space, there's also a lot of national litigation from groups, communities in Africa and other places, South America, coming to European countries where they lodge national litigation. So basically just using tort law, for example, to get a claim. So that's also a very interesting development, and a lot of tort experts have been saying, is this widening the scope of national tort law, or is this actually helping in shaping policy? So you might be interested in that. And one example, I think it's more in a civil society context, but there was a bit of a disaster in the UAE where there was a project planting, I think around 100 trees or something like that. I don't know the number exactly. And then all those trees died because they started building real estate around the area. So there were some activists trying to pursue legal action. So you might be interested in that.
That's super interesting. I don't know anything about it, so that's very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
It's obviously a huge topic to explore. Do we have any final questions for Glada on climate and Oman? We'll take one here and then we'll...
Thank you so much again, Mr. Regeneration. Thank you. Sorry, my voice has changed. My question was more about food and how Oman is coping with just food and growing of vegetation. So are they exploring much vertical farming? And also in terms of vegetation coping under heat waves and sandstorms, is there much exploration about that? And are they necessarily, like the innovation they're thinking about, would they be using growing, I know in Morocco, in deserts, in the Sahara, they grow plants under solar panels, but there's actually disputes whether that's effective or not. So I was just really interested to hear about that and how the vegetation there for food is how they're exploring that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, and I'm definitely not really qualified to answer that, but I've seen, so one thing I've seen is the work that Sultan Qaboos University is doing on plants that can be adapted to saline soils, as I mentioned, because that's a huge issue in areas like Batina. They've actually found certain types of tomatoes and certain other vegetables can be adapted to the saline soils. The biosaline agriculture at Nimr will be interesting to watch. There's also interest in hydroponics. I don't know whether they've done as much as Jordan. Jordan has the Sahara Forest project going on in the south, which seems to be proving effective in terms of use of hydroponics and interesting like solar greenhouses there. And there is there are some vertical farming I don't know about in Oman, but certainly in the UAE and Jordan I've seen some examples there, and it's definitely an area where it will really benefit from cross fertilization between both academics and farming communities. I don't think there's really enough of that at the moment. Agriculture has not been given, it's not being treated as much of a sexy topic in the region until recently. Now it's going to be a priority, certainly for the UAE, probably for Egypt as well, but certainly the UAE when they hold the COP28. They have, you know, the climate minister is very, very passionate about this issue, and I expect you will see a lot of innovation coming out of the finance for that.
It's a quick related comment.
30 seconds, thank you.
I think from my side, I'm a political scientist and I'm also an engineer, so I worked on the oil rigs with the German company, Schlumberger. So I saw the whole process. But my question is because civil society is weak in the whole region, what would you recommend? What path should someone wants to push for a certain agenda? I think you should go through the governments, especially the Gulf governments, not because of anything, but because of the financial cushion that they have, and because of the connections that they have with the West. So what would be a quick win in that regard? To push through the governments, UAE, Saudi especially, because I think if the Saudis lead the effort, this will get reflected in the whole region. I don't think that civil society is capable of doing anything in this region. So.
That's a difficult question for me to answer. Would you pursue it through the government or otherwise? I think we were trying to, in the report, trying to say that, for instance, if there is a partner country like the UK wanting to work on a climate resilient project, they should, wherever possible, create a project that does involve at least the local municipalities and ideally some civil society, so they are networked with the national ministry in charge, and so it is a cooperative and accountable process. There was some of the criticisms, for instance, of European funding came about because they felt that European finance had been captured by a small group of elites in, say, Lebanon, in Lebanese context, for example, and therefore it had not been deployed efficiently and effectively. And they said that more involvement of civil society from the beginning of the project would have helped it to be accountable. So not bypassing the government, but just making sure that the finance is actually dependent on working together. So I think that's one way. But also, I've been impressed with. When you think of, it's not always just as you know, government is not monolithic, right? I mean, there are many agencies within it, and some are more effective than others, and it's very much a case of finding partners that really believe in what they're doing, and helping to build that capacity to, I guess, reach out beyond your government borders and listen to experts, because you always hear from academics, like yourself and others in the region, like, we've been doing this study, we've made this fantastic model, and it's not being incorporated into policymakers. So wherever there's an opportunity to provide that space for dialogue, like you do at the GRC, and then that's a good thing, because policymakers and consultants who work for the government can have exposure to real people on the ground, local people who deal with these issues every day, and really have the local knowledge to make something happen, rather than it being imposed, by your nice kind of McKinsey or KPMG or whatever from above.
Thank you so much. We'll draw this to a close now, and really appreciate your time today, Glada. Let's thank our speaker in the customary way.